Olá a todas e todos, este é mais um BdF Entrevista Internacional, edição especial do BdF Entrevista. Uma vez por mês vamos trazer convidadas e convidados de fora do país para debater temas globais. O convidado desse programa é o cientista político, pesquisador Vijay Prashad. Hello Vijay, thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot, great to be with you, with Brasil de Fato.
Vijay Prashad é um historiador e jornalista indiano. Atualmente ele trabalha como escritor e correspondente-chefe do site Globetrotter. É editor da Leftward Books e diretor do Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social. Já escreveu mais de 20 livros, incluindo The Darker Nations and the Poorer Nations. E os mais recentes em tradução livre, A Luta que nos faz humanos, Aprendendo com movimentos pelo socialismo e a retirada Iraque, Líbia, Afeganistão e a fragilidade do poder dos Estados Unidos, que escreveu com Noam Chomsky. So the first question I want to make you is, so we're reaching 6 months of the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Could we say, or do you think that what we have consolidating is a division in two blocks, one led by the US and some European countries and the other one led by China and Russia?
I think there are actually 3 blocks. There is one block of countries that don't want to be led by anybody, that in fact would like this conflict to end tomorrow. After all, what has this conflict produced for most of the world? It's produced higher food prices, higher fuel prices. So many countries say this is not our conflict, we want this conflict to end. So that's the third block. There is, in fact, a division taking place, but it's not a division that's around the Ukraine war alone. This division has been there from before the Ukraine war. In fact, it provoked the Ukraine war. You see, the United States has been very anxious about the integration of Europe with Asia. Russian energy entering Eastern Europe and then into Germany and the rest of Europe. Chinese investment and technology coming into Europe. Europe has found itself in a curious position because rationally it should integrate with Asia, but politically it's somehow linked through NATO, through its affinities, with the United States, it's linked across the Atlantic. So Europe is in the middle of the crosshairs and has been for a long time. So I feel that it's the United States that has provoked a conflict, asking the Europeans to choose, in a sense, between the United States and Russia and China. You see, Russia and China have not asked Europe to choose anything. The Russians simply want to sell energy to the Europeans. The Chinese simply want to invest and provide technology into Europe. They have not provoked a division. The United States has provoked a division. So yes, there is a division, but it's not a division where both sides have turned their backs on each other. In fact, the United States is imposing a conflict, and that's what we are seeing not only in Ukraine but also in Taiwan.
So talking about this third block of countries, or let's say call it a fragmented block, but how other countries, especially big countries like India, fit in this context?
See, India is in an interesting position because India's government, a government of the far right, has very close emotional and political links with the United States. But India as a country has 2 problems with the conflict in Ukraine. Number one, India has a very long and close association with Russia. Not only because, for instance, Russia provides arms to India, a lot of weapons to India, but also there's a historical tie between the Soviet Union and India that goes back to the 1950s. It's hard to break that linkage. Secondly, India is a country of 1.4 billion people. 700 million of them are struggling with inflation and so on. Now the Russians have said, look, we are willing to sell you oil, natural gas, whatever you want at a discounted price. So the Indians have said, of course we are going to buy your oil at a discounted price. So for the second reason, a more pragmatic reason, India has decided not to align with the United States on this issue. But we should not misunderstand what's happening. It's not that India has somehow broken with the United States. It's that pragmatically India needs to buy discounted Russian oil, and there are old relations with the Russians. It's very much the same with many countries on the African continent, which can't break, as it were, with Russia, because they're integrated one way or the other with the Russian economy. You see, the United States in the 1990s drove a policy of globalization, which made countries integrate with each other. So now the United States is saying, no, we want to divide the world into two, a US sphere of influence and a Chinese sphere of influence. It can't happen, even in Brazil. Bolsonaro, is a pro-US character. But even Bolsonaro cannot break with China. They have to continue to sell, primary goods and other goods to the Chinese. So this attempt to break ties with Russia or China is very complicated. So I would like people not to overestimate changes taking place in the world today. But at the other hand, we have to understand that the US imposed project is not a rational project for many countries.
So something that you mentioned, so the consequences of the whole set of occurrences, right? And also, you also have the sanctions imposing some pressing needs. So I will mention two. One is fuel and energy that skyrocket prices, and the other is food. You have hunger, right? What challenges that it poses to the popular camp?
Well, firstly, it makes everyday life difficult for people. You see, the more difficult everyday life is, it makes people demoralized. They don't have time to actually go and protest. They don't have money to get on the buses to go to protest. You have to understand it from that point of view. High fuel and food prices demoralizes society. It in fact doesn't necessarily create protests. But in some places we are seeing massive demonstrations. In Sri Lanka, for instance, there was a huge popular uprising, overthrew the Prime Minister, but didn't change the balance of forces in the country, because the caretaker who came in place of the previous president and Prime Minister basically is following the same policies as the previous government. But there was still a mass uprising. In Bangladesh, while we are speaking, there is a massive wave of protests taking place in Bangladesh. Don't know what's going to happen. So on the one side, we are seeing demoralization in some countries. People are just upset, angry, they're not able to feed their children and so on, and this creates its own depression. On the other side, we see people very angry coming onto the street, but they're not able to advance a political project. We're at a point now from the Arab Spring of 2011, when we had massive uprisings and so on, right to the present, where people protest, but the protest doesn't necessarily convert into political change. The one country which has actually shown the cycles of protests leading to political change is Colombia, where the big cycle of protest, in fact from 2016, when the peace agreement was signed, and then 2019, and then 2020, and then 2021, brought the sections of people's movements together with the left to drive an election campaign which elected Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez. Colombia is actually not an example for other countries right now. Most countries are seeing mass demonstrations and then political frustration. In Colombia, in fact, interestingly, mass demonstration resulted in political change.
So you mentioned Colombia and Petro. How do you see these movements? I'll mention specifically Petro, but also Boric in Chile. I know they're different, but what kind of message or movement or trend they sign to, they point to?
See, politics is an interesting business. You can't do things if the balance of forces in your country is not sufficiently favoring a certain agenda. If trade union movements are weak, if peasant movements are weak, if the precarious workers are disorganized and fragmented, you can't move an agenda that's going to be totally pro-people. So we have to face some facts. Right now, in most countries in the world, people's movements are at a weak point. They haven't consolidated their strength and so on. We don't really have the capacity to drive a full agenda. In Latin America, in my opinion, there have been 4 waves since the Cuban Revolution. The immediate revolutionary movements after 1959, they were crushed by military dictatorships, such as in Brazil in 1964. The second wave was the wave in Nicaragua, in Grenada in 1979. This was a wave, again, of national liberation forces which took power, crushed now by direct military intervention by the United States. They didn't do Pinochet, they didn't do the generals in Brazil, they directly intervened. The third wave was Chavez, 1998, 1999, and that because the United States was distracted by Iraq, because of high commodity prices, that wave actually was able to do a lot of things, regional integration, putting people's projects on the map and so on. And the Chavez moment opened a new door in very many parts of South America particularly. So that was the third wave. Now, commodity prices have collapsed, people's movements have been fragmented by the long-term economic crisis, but also by the pandemic. We're in a position where the United States is now contesting China in Latin America. So this is not a time favorable for a hard left agenda. That's why I think logically governments of the center left have appeared. Gabriel Boric's government is not an outlier. It in fact defines the possibilities in South America. You see what's happening in Argentina, the campaign against Cristina Kirchner, that suggests that you can't go too left, you'll be brought back. I think a government of President Lula is also going to face that. What people's movements have to acknowledge in a way is people's movements have to strengthen themselves and change the actual conditions in society, produce the road down which politicians can walk. Politicians can't make that road. It's people's movements that have to be there creating new possibilities. Right now, South America, Latin America, those alternative possibilities are not so visible.
So Vijay, you recently went to Chile to make a news report about lithium, and you're making some investigations about that. Could you tell us why take lithium? I know it connects with land and sovereignty, but how this can express something about the challenges of the popular camp?
There is naturally a worry about the reliance upon carbon-based fuel. So there's a move to convert to non-carbon based fuels, or perhaps just even natural gas, which is also a fossil fuel but not as bad as coal and so on. Well, many of the non-carbon fuels like solar, like hydroelectric, they require forms of preserving the energy, particularly solar. You need batteries for solar. Well, the current technology for batteries needs things like lithium. Lithium is a major part of the new green technology world. So everybody's excited about the transition to green. Well, I'm interested in what does it take to produce green technology. One of the key pieces is lithium. So let's go see where lithium is made. Well, a lot of the world's lithium, not all of it, some is in Australia, some of it is in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. But a lot of the known lithium is in the so-called ABC countries, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Chile, in the Atacama Desert, has an immense deposit of lithium. The problem is that what we've already known is that there's an excessive use of groundwater, precious groundwater. Chile has a serious problem with water sources. Excessive use of groundwater as brine to go in there and make the lithium into the barely processed ore that then gets exported. So we were interested in seeing that, the fact that people are losing groundwater, there's toxics in the atmosphere, that the pink flamingos are getting extinct and so on. So we traveled around. It's very hard to get to the actual mines because the private mining companies, one of the biggest ones is owned by Augusto Pinochet's son-in-law. Till today, Pinochet is dead and gone, the dictatorship is dead and gone, but his son-in-law still owns one of the biggest lithium mining companies in Chile. So we were interested in exploring that. Now, this begs the question, across the border, what's happening in Bolivia? The Bolivians, since Evo Morales' entry into office for the first time, have put on the table the concept of resource nationalism. In other words, look, it's true that in most parts of the world you have to be very careful how you use your resources. You can't go in there and use toxics to get it out. But on the other hand, we're going to have to get some of these things out. We're going to have to extract some resources from the earth. We have to do it carefully. But that's not enough. The real question is, having extracted the ore, what do you do with it? Well, a country like Chile has just been selling it to multinational corporations, getting very low royalties. The Bolivians had a different project. Can we take the lithium? Can we process it in Bolivia? Can we make batteries in Bolivia? And then can we make electric cars? And in fact, they have succeeded. But even they are facing a problem. They don't have enough capital to keep upgrading the Bolivian, mine to electric car chain. So they are also going to multinational corporations and saying, help us. So we were interested in looking at the real problems here of both the so-called green transition, but also resource nationalism.
So coming a little bit to the Brazilian situation, and as you mentioned, what a possible victory of Lula could, well, first of all, thinking about Latin America, but also in a more broad picture, how it could influence BRICS and this a little bit of axis that we were talking about.
He was one of the first Brazilian presidents who basically was at the center of world events. If I'm honest with you, I know the name Cardoso, but because he was an economist. I knew his technical work before he became president. When Cardoso was president, he was not going all over and doing various things. Bolsonaro is known largely for his clownish kind of attitude to the world, not because of his statesmanship on world stage. We don't know him in that regard. But Lula was known for that. What was precisely the elements that Lula was known for? And this is important because I think there'll be a straight line from Lula's second presidency to this. What is that? Number one, the link with Africa is actually prior to the BRICS issue. That Lula traveled to Africa, he made these connections first to Portuguese-speaking African countries, and he made the argument that because of the Atlantic slave trade, Brazil and Africa are related to each other, and they created a university and so on. So I'm interested to see Brazil again coming back to Africa to contest what the French and the United States are doing there, to open space up for African countries to have a South-South linkage rather than again be reintegrated into European and US pathways. So that's one thing could be interesting. BRICS is complicated, and it's complicated because Russia and China have, in a sense, in the last few years, developed their own bilateral ties, including strategic ties and so on. I'm not exactly sure whether the 5 countries of BRICS will be able to be on an equal footing in this next period. One hopes they will. See, one of the BRICS countries is India. And if President Lula comes back, if you have President Lula, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has already suggested he is interested in a kind of non-US dominated BRICS. Will India go along? And if the conflict in Ukraine comes to a close, will India maintain this new posture of independence? I don't know. So I'm not clear about whether the BRICS will be a big avenue forward, but it's certainly the case. And I feel that this was directly stated by Lula at that event for the release of the book, that this idea of Brazil once more being an important player in the world, it's going to be important. You remember, Brazil played a key role in the negotiations around Iran. In fact, Lula got a deal with the Iranians, which the Americans later betrayed, unfortunately, because it was a good deal. If the Brazilians come in again and start moderating some of these things, I think that would be a very great advance for world affairs.
So talking a little bit about India, but also looking at these patterns of the far right, coming to power. In India, as in Brazil, actually, Modi went to power, let's say, through electoral channels, right? Even though he used, let's call it, unethical ways like fake news and stuff. Do you think there is, well, we saw there is a pattern for this, even Trump, Bolsonaro, these figures, these groups, that to get to power, they had methods and tactics. Looking at this new cycle, and maybe actually comparing India and the pot, do you see this could enhance, strengthen, or you think no, we can't pass through the worst moment of this?
I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think if Mr. Bolsonaro loses the election in October, the Bolsonaro type politics is going to be there with you for a long time. And what's the politics? I mean, you and I, we are journalists. We understand a little bit of how the media functions. But, we also believe in truth, in, telling the same thing in different channels. If I'm talking to you here with Brasil de Fato, I'll tell you something that I would also write on my Facebook wall. I'd say the same thing to my family. We try to be coherent and so on. We have to come to terms with the fact that we're dealing with a far right that are actually media professionals. They know how to use the media. I mean, I've seen Mr. Bolsonaro, for instance, he'll say one thing in a far-right periodical. He'll say something super offensive in a far-right periodical. When a mainstream paper asks him, why did you say that? He says, I never said that. And he's very clever. They know how to work the media. This idea of working the media is interesting. They understand the different kinds of forms, how they should behave, stand with a gun one day, go to another place in a suit, pretend you're They know how to do this, and they have built up a constituency of people who also feel like they can't speak openly, the offensive things they want to say. Every society has a constituency of people who feel like they are not allowed to be offensive, okay? They can't be sexist, they can't be racist, they can't be, and poor them, boo-hoo, but boo-hoo them from my perspective, meaning I'm glad you can't be racist openly, without some kind of censure. But you see, these politicians have showed up and they've done something clever. They say that, okay, there's an economic crisis, okay? But the economic crisis is not because of capitalism. Economic crisis is because of homosexuals. Economic crisis because women are in the workplace. Feminism. Economic crisis because of migrants. They use this feeling of, I can't say offensive things to explain the crisis of capitalism. So the people who are owners of property and so on are perfectly happy with these chaps. That's the reason why you actually don't need to suspend democracy for this strand of politics to continue. Mr. Modi got elected, as you say. They don't want to get rid of the constitution. They are perfectly happy to use democratic channels to create this constituency. In other words, the democratic spirit may be, disappearing, but the democratic institutions are still there. These are not people who want to create a fascist coup. Why should they? If you come to power through an election, why do you want to stop elections? It makes no sense. It's a new kind of politics. But there's two pieces to this. One is that they really know how to manipulate communication and the media. And the second is that they found a clever way to make this constituency of people who are disgruntled, people who may be poor, but they are disgruntled along the axis of social change. And they've used this disgruntlement essentially to build their pretty large constituencies, 30%, 35%. That's a pretty good constituency, a permanent constituency. Trump has still about 30% of people in the United States in his camp. That's all you need. That's a huge constituency. The left has 5, 6, 8%. So we can't say 30% is nothing.
Still in India, Modi's slogan was make it in India, right? And she suggested protectionist economic measures that supposedly would create jobs. But India still has a problem. And so how do you assess the situation today of India and Modi? And if you could see something like we had last year with the farmers' protests, do you think there's a situation that this could happen?
You see, make in India, it's a very curious phrase. It's not actually a coherent argument about protectionism or anything. It's just that we are going to create industry or digital economies inside India. Let's be frank. if you have a population that is largely struggling with hunger, malnutrition, they have problems of sickness, education levels are not high, this population cannot be a part of the 21st century's working class. Because the working class is no more somebody with a hammer smashing something, you know. Most factories today are robotized. You need a level of education. You need good public transport to get to your workplace. You can't keep falling sick because you've got malnutrition. You've got to have energy to work and so on. When you compare the Chinese and Indian working class, it's night and day. You know, the Indian working class is not as efficient or productive as the Chinese working class. So it's difficult to say make in India. Oh, sorry, I can say it, but it's difficult to actually make it real. So Modi used this as a sort of magic trick. Now what it has come to mean is more privatization to his friends, to Indian billionaires, like his friend Mr. Adani, now one of the world's richest men. So make in India means make billionaires in India, not make goods in India. Goods are still imported largely from outside. That is serious capital goods. So it's not happening, you know, and it won't happen. It won't happen. Why? Not because of the lack of investment of capital, but because of the lack of human investment. You know, we must understand that lifting the standard of life for people actually enables productivity. You know, if you are unable to travel easily to your workplace, you come to your work tired. If you come to your work tired, you're less productive. These things are all obvious.
So Vijay, still about India, the Communist Party runs the state of Kerala, right? Do you think this could be an example or a model for a success government of a left party?
Frankly, the left front, the left democratic front, which is the government in Kerala, is always experimenting. So I'm uncomfortable with the idea of anybody being a model for anybody. Because socialism is a form of experiments. You know, you do things, they don't work. You do things sincerely to improve not only the conditions of people's lives, but their confidence. You know, because more and more we want people to be solving their own problems. We don't want to build a world where we all rely on the government. We want people to feel confident they can gather collectively to solve their problems. So in Kerala, there's a lot of attempt to rescue the collective life. You know, during the COVID pandemic, student movements, youth movements, women's movement went out there. Youth movement went door to door in the city of Trivandrum, the capital of Kerala, and asked people, do you need anything? Are you okay? Do you want us to get you medicines? With checked lists they made. And then they would help people. They would go and buy medicines for them and so on. And as a consequence of that, by the way, this immense activity of going door to door to everybody's house, as a consequence of that, one of the young women of the youth movement who did this is now the mayor of Trivandrum. She's 21 years old, you know. Her name is Arya Rajendran. But yes, immense things are happening. I'll give you one example. The state of Kerala has decided to create universal government-provided high-speed internet. So 20% of the population below the poverty line will get basically free internet from the government. The others have access to that. But if they don't want it, they can get private providers. But you have access to high quality free. I mean, that's the choice that people need to make. You know, there are high quality government schools, there are private schools. You want to go spend a lot of money, go. What we're seeing is as the quality of the government schools is improved, people are moving their children back to government schools from private schools. So these are the kinds of experiments of building the confidence of people in a kind of left project. I wish we had like 2 hours. I can tell you hundreds of these kind of initiatives. But the point is, you and I have to report these initiatives to each other.
Well, Vijay, thank you very much. Thank you for being at our house and talking to us.
Thanks a lot.
Esse foi o BdF Entrevista Internacional. Até o próximo programa.